Hey, how's it going, everyone? My name is Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for February of 2019 for Virgo and Virgo rising. So tonight I'm doing a bit of an experiment where I'm doing a live stream simultaneously to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter with the horoscopes for February. And I am about to be halfway through once I finish this one. So far, so good. If anybody has any questions that's watching this live in the chat, then just post them in the chat box, either on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, and then I'll try to respond to them as we go through it. So I'm going to be looking at the planetary transits for everybody for February, well, for Virgo rising, everybody with Virgo rising or their sun in Virgo, especially if you have a day chart, or your moon in Virgo, especially if you have a night chart. So let's jump right into it. So here is the calendar, which shows the ingresses of the planets during different dates of the month during the month of February. It also shows the two lunations, which is the new moon in Aquarius on the 4th and the full moon in Virgo in your rising sign on the 19th. The other chart we have this month is the planetary movements calendar, which shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and where they'll end up by the end of the month. So that's kind of useful in terms of showing how fast some of the planets are and how quickly they move through certain signs versus the outer planets, which stay pretty much stationary or don't move very far at all through certain signs over the course of 4 weeks. But the main chart that we're going to focus on is the solar fire chart, which shows the exact positions of the planets on each day of the month. I'm going to start it off here with Virgo rising on February 1st at the very top of the month, and then animate it and move it through the month just to see the specific transits that we're going to be looking at over the course of the next few weeks. All right, so where should we get started? So this month, as I've said in some of the other horoscopes so far, there's not a lot of outer planet activity happening that's really notable. So for some of you, you might have outer planets hitting exact aspects with some of your natal chart placements, and that's going to be particularly important for you. But just in terms of talking about the outer planets in general this month, there's no outer planet stations, there's no sign ingresses. So there's not a lot of major things to focus on in terms of the outer planets, even though we've talked about them pretty extensively in past months' horoscopes. There will be an ingress of Uranus into Taurus next month, which is a major shift for everybody in different parts of your chart or different parts of your life, but I'll have to save most of the discussion about that for March, for the horoscopes for March. So what we can focus on is there's 4 or 5 notable inner planet transits that will probably characterize most of this month. So that's what we're going to focus on here today. So the first of those is that there's a major distinction this month between the first half of the month with Mars transiting through Aries and the second half of the month where it ingresses into Taurus. So for you, that's going to be a transit of Mars, the continuation or the completion of the transit of Mars through your 8th house as it's going through Aries, and then the start of its transit through your 9th house once it goes into Taurus. So last month, Cam White and I talked a lot about the transit of Mars through your 8th house. The 8th house is primarily the house of shared resources and other people's money. It can also be a house that has to do with things like mortality, inheritance, taxes, your partner's money or other people's money in general. And with Mars transiting through that house, sometimes it can put more focus or put greater energy into that area of your life during the course of that transit over like a month and a half or so. But other times it can sometimes indicate greater expenditures of money. It can indicate sometimes conflicts over money or unexpected disputes. And that's something that at the very tail end of this transit, when Mars conjoins Uranus right around February 12th or February 13th before it departs from Aries and moves into Taurus, that potential is heightened a little bit just because Mars-Uranus conjunctions tend to be kind of explosive and can sometimes produce sudden and unexpected results and developments in the part of our chart that they're transiting at the time. So you want to pay a special attention and be careful this month, especially if you have any sort of business partnership, about the sort of financial dealings between the two of you, because you don't want any unexpected disputes sort of erupting with other people over money if it's something that can be sort of dealt with or warded off just by being extra careful or extra cautious. Another thing that's important to be careful of with when Mars is transiting the second or eighth house is sometimes like impulsive spending, or spending a lot of money impulsively in a way that racks up debt or creates an additional financial burden for yourself that's unnecessary. So if you want to do that, I mean, if that's something that's called for, or if you don't really care, then go ahead and go nuts. But if it's something where you might regret it later on when you're in a more sober frame of mind, then you might want to exercise greater caution this month when it comes to unexpected financial or impulsive financial expenditures. So that's going on in the first half of the month. Then by February 14th, we have Mars, we can see here, ingressing into Taurus and going into your ninth house. The ninth house is a very broad house. It has a lot of different meanings. Some of the core meanings of the ninth house are education, beliefs, like one's religious or philosophical beliefs about the world. It can also indicate travel and exposure to foreign cultures and foreign places or people that are foreign or different in some way from your own culture or wherever you grew up. So with Mars going into that house, sometimes, again, it's just bringing greater energy and focus into that area of your life. So for some of you, this could be greater expenditure of energy when it comes to education and really having to throw yourself into some project, let's say at school, if you're still a person who's in school. Other people might throw themselves into a project that has to do with a trip that's coming up, or with some sort of interaction with like a foreign culture or a foreign place that requires greater attention than at other times in their life. For some people, so those are some of the more constructive manifestations of a transit like Mars going through your ninth house. And that's going to be especially more common for people with night charts to get the more constructive manifestation. For those of you with day charts, there's the potential for irritation coming from that area of your life or that area of your chart, and the potential sometimes where Mars can result in irritation that leads to like conflicts or disputes over ninth house topics. So it could be like getting into an ideological conflict with somebody, or feeling more irritated as a result of something that you learned, which becomes problematic in some way, or that sort of erupts into, like, I'm trying to think of a specific scenario where you might get into an ideological dispute with somebody, either over a philosophical matter or over a religious matter, where I've seen that happen natally if people have that sort of predisposition or tendency in the natal chart. But in terms of a short-term transit, because this is only happening for like a month and a half, it might be a period in which, due to your sort of beliefs, that you might, in some instances, I've seen people act like more militantly about what they believe or what their political or religious opinions are than usual. And sometimes this can create conflict with them, with other people in their life, if they're not careful. So if that's something where, you don't really care if it creates conflict or if it creates divisions in your life, or if it's something that feels necessary or constructive to you, then, go nuts, and that's fine. But if you're somebody where you're not necessarily, where even if you have strong convictions, but you're not necessarily trying to create discord in your life as a result of that, then you might want to be careful if you do find yourself getting into any intense or important discussions over delicate philosophical or religious or political matters this month in the second half of February, just because there's a greater tendency for it to lead to conflict than normal compared to other times in your life. Other ninth house manifestations, sometimes it can mean a challenge or an obstacle that comes up while traveling or while being abroad. That's not necessarily a deal breaker per se. It really depends on your natal chart, but it's something certainly to be aware of and to be cautious about. So that's the Mars transit that's happening, especially in the second half of the month, because Mars only makes it to about 10 degrees of Taurus by the end of February. And so it's going to spend most of the rest of March also going through Taurus. So the greater part of that transit is not going to take place until next month. But because the ingress takes place here around February 14th, there's a real distinct sort of set of chapters, or there's a real distinct division or transition that occurs from the first half of the month to the second half as a result of that ingress. So that's one of the major inner planet transits that's going on this month for Virgo rising. The other major transit that's happening has to do with Venus. So Venus this month, it starts off the month of February in late Sagittarius, in your fourth house of your home and your living situation and your parents. And that's where we had that Venus-Jupiter conjunction that we talked about a lot on last month's horoscope that happened in like mid to late January, which you could actually see in the night sky shortly before sunrise each day. But pretty early on in February, Venus departs from Sagittarius and moves out of your fourth house and moves into Capricorn and into your fifth house. And it's pretty much transiting through that house for the entirety of February, and this is one of the more characteristic transits of this month, aside from that Mars transit through Aries and Taurus. So it looks like during the course of that, we have a Venus-Saturn conjunction that occurs around February 17th. Then we have a Venus-Pluto conjunction, which is pretty intense, around February 22nd. And then finally, there's a Venus-Uranus square, which occurs just before the end of the month and just before Venus leaves that sign and moves into Aquarius for most of the rest of March. So the fifth house is a house that has to do with, in terms of people in your life, the fifth house typically has to do with the topic of children, which is sometimes either your own children if you have children, or just the topic of children or younger people in your life in general. The fifth house is also the house that has to do with creativity. The fifth house is also commonly associated with romantic partnerships or romantic affairs. It's sort of the other house besides the seventh house that has to do with relationships and intimacy and things like that. So Venus actually ingressing into this house can be really positive, actually, in terms of romantic relationships during the course of this month. And one of the things that's good about that is it's actually counterbalancing a more challenging transit that you've been having going on over the course of the past year with Saturn going through your fifth house. So especially for those of you with night charts, that fifth house Saturn transit can have more of a restrictive or a cooling down type, I don't want to say quote unquote influence. It's not an actual influence, but let's say it correlates with more of a cooling down period or a more restrictive period in terms of some of those topics. And having Venus ingress into that sign can really warm things up a bit and sort of counterbalance some of the coldness of Saturn, and bring a sort of antidote or a rectification to some of the issues that you may have been experiencing, or some of the challenges that you may have been experiencing in terms of that transit so far. So Venus going through the fifth house basically is not just, it's counterbalancing Saturn and indicating a rectification of some of the challenges or obstacles or difficulties that you've had over the past year since Saturn went into that sector of your chart in December of 2017, but also just in terms of a short-term transit, it can be a great transit for either improving relationships with the people represented by the fifth house, which is like if you have children, then improving relationships with children. If you have a romantic partner, it can indicate having a more positive period romantically over the course of February. And it really peaks at those two times when we have the Venus-Saturn conjunction around the 17th, and then the Venus-Pluto conjunction around the 22nd. And then finally, it's sort of capped off by the Venus-Uranus square at the very end of the month. So the only thing is just those are kind of tricky aspects where Venus-Pluto conjunctions can be very intense. And when things are good, they're really good. And when things are bad, they can sometimes go to the other extreme of being really bad. And then Venus-Uranus, of course, is exciting, but sometimes unstable and short-lived. So sometimes if these are coinciding with like the beginning of like romantic relationships, you definitely want to be a little bit more careful just because of that potential for intensity and some instability with the Venus-Pluto conjunction and then the Venus-Uranus square. So that's the Venus transit this month, and that's going to characterize this month, but once we get into March, it's pretty much over because Venus goes into Aquarius. It's going to be more positive for people with night charts, and it's going to be a bit more muted for people with day charts. But for those of you in general, if you have Venus activated as a Time Lord this year through annual perfections or something like that, it should be a good transit that's enjoyable one way or another to a certain extent. If anybody who's watching the live stream has any questions, definitely let me know in the chat window, either on YouTube or on Facebook or on Twitter, and I'll try to answer those as we go here. Is there anybody watching who has Virgo rising that has any questions about some of these upcoming transits? Okay, interesting. So yeah, we got some comments coming in, so keep them coming as I go here. So the Mars transit is the first major one. The Venus transit is the second major thing I meant to talk about. The other thing I wanted to touch on is the two lunations that take place this month, the new moon and the full moon. So let's switch over to the planetary movements calendar. So we've got a new moon that's taking place in Aquarius on the 4th of February. And since it's happening in Aquarius, that is your 6th whole sign house for those of you with Virgo rising. So the 6th house has to do primarily with two topics, either with work or secondarily with health matters. And sometimes traditionally it was the house that had to do with illness, but more practically speaking in modern times it tends to have to do with health matters in general, which can mean both sort of dealing with illness or physical infirmities, but also sometimes what it takes to avoid those things or ward those things off, which is the attempt to maintain good health and good habits and other things surrounding bodily matters, basically. So with a new moon happening in Aquarius this month, there's some sort of new chapter or new beginning that you're going to be opening up around February 4th with respect to one of those topics of either work or health. So it can be a good time for, let's say, for example, starting a new job if it has more to do with your work and your career, or starting a new phase in your current job, perhaps. For other people, if it's focused on your health, it can be a good time to start a new either physical or dietary sort of regimen in order to proactively maintain your health and in order to proactively institute sort of things in your life that won't play out initially or won't be immediately apparent, but in the long term, if you keep working on them, they will eventually get sort of built into your life as good long-term habits. So, if you need to start seeing a doctor, if you need to start going to the gym or working out to maintain physical health, if you've been meaning to try doing something in terms of your diet or in terms of medicine or other things that you could be taking in order to maintain better optimal health, using that new moon to start something like that will work out in the long term would be a pretty good idea. So eventually, whatever you start at this time will culminate about 6 months later, or 6 months from now, when we have a full moon that will take place in Aquarius later this year. But the key thing is just to start something in that area now proactively that will grow and develop almost imperceptibly at first until it eventually matures 6 months later. The other major lunation that we have this month, or the other notable lunation, is we have a full moon that's taking place in Virgo in your first house, and it goes exact on the 19th of February. So the first house has to do with both, the first house is the house where the sky and the earth meet, and symbolically in ancient astrology, the first house is associated with both the mind and the spirit, as well as the body or the physical incarnation. So first house matters have that dual character of either being about mental things or being about physical things that have to pertain to the body. So to a certain extent, this is kind of repeating some of the themes that we were talking about earlier with the 6th house that have to do with the body and maintaining physical health. But the full moon in the first house, you also always have to take into account this sort of mental or character-based side of that as well. And since it's a full moon, it's some sort of development that started probably 6 months ago that's now starting to become clearer or starting to manifest in a way that's more evident in your life. So for some people, this can be like a personality development where maybe there was a part of your personality that started to grow, or some new habits that you started getting started developing 6 months ago that are just now starting to play a more major role in your life and to become more evident as like permanent personality or character traits. So for some of you, if those are like good things, or if it was something positive that you started 6 months ago that you did, let's say deliberately, then it could be something that starts where you start actually seeing the results of that now. And if it's something that's positive, then just keep doing it and it will continue to become a more major part of your life as you move forward. Whereas conversely, if there's something either about your character or about bodily habits which you see start to emerge at this time that is not necessarily something positive, then this would be the point when it becomes more evident to attempt to institute some sort of change or some sort of correction in your overall course. And if you do so now, then you may be able to successfully mitigate things or successfully start heading in a new direction in terms of that, which will then manifest and develop over the course of the next 6 months. So either way, it's sort of a maturation or something is starting to become more visible with respect to your personality or with respect to your body at this time. And that's really the main symbolic focus of having a full moon take place in your first house around the 19th of February. All right, so other major transits this month. Let me check really quick and see if we've got any more questions. I think everybody's still good in terms of questions in the chat so far. So the last major interplanet transit that I meant to mention that is not super major, but it's getting prepped for something that will be more significant next month is Mercury is moving through Pisces. So earlier in the month, it starts off in Aquarius along with the sun, and that's where the new moon takes place. But Mercury actually goes into your 7th house around February 10th. So it ingresses into the house that has to do with relationships. And sometimes this can indicate a period of greater communication and greater exchanges in terms of relationships in your life at this time, starting around February 10th. But it eventually catches up with and conjoins Neptune around mid-month, around February 18th at 15 degrees of Pisces. And then it keeps going, which would normally be kind of the end of it. But what ends up happening is Mercury starts slowing down towards the end of February. And in early March, Mercury actually stations retrograde at 29 degrees of Pisces. So what that means is that we're actually getting ready for a Mercury retrograde in your 7th house of relationships. And since you have Virgo rising, Mercury is actually your ruling planet. So there's the potential for this retrograde to be more notable or more important for you compared to other people. That's especially the case, of course, if Mercury is activated this year for some reason according to one of the Time Lord techniques like annual profections. And I have a video on annual profections if you do a search for it on my YouTube channel where I introduce you to the technique and explain how to calculate it. So Mercury goes retrograde in Pisces in your 7th house of relationships next month, and it actually stations direct conjunct Neptune around the end of March. So that's basically then a Mercury retrograde in your 7th house, but it's kind of compounded a little bit by Neptune. And Mercury-Neptune aspects can be tricky because sometimes they have to do with miscommunication or things where Mercury's primary goal is to like communicate messages and information clearly, whereas Neptune's primary significations have to do with whatever the opposite of that is, which is making things unclear, making things mysterious, making things sort of foggy in some sense. So one of the things that you want to be careful about is miscommunications that have to do with relationships, either in a like a romantic sense or just with one-on-one other people in your life in general, starting in the 2nd half of February. So this isn't something that's necessarily going to manifest itself completely in February. This is actually primarily something that's coming up in March. And so I'm getting a little ahead of myself by going into this at this point. But I'm mentioning it because as soon as Mercury conjoins Neptune, it's actually going to be in its shadow, because 16 degrees of Pisces is the degree that it's going to retrograde back to. And so there's something that happens in the later part of February that sort of sets up the sequence of events so that if this Mercury retrograde is going to be important for you, and if it is going to pertain to your seventh house of relationships and partnerships, then there's something about those events that happen in March that actually get their start towards the end of February. So one of the things you want to be careful about is just being as clear as you possibly can in terms of communication with other people, especially with partners in your life during the latter part of February, even though that's going to be possibly a little bit more challenging than usual. But it's something that's worth striving for just because it may save you some headaches later on if you go out of your way to be extra careful or extra clear in your communications. It can probably remove or mitigate some of the sort of worst potentials of what's going to come up during the Mercury retrograde during the course of March. So, and that's my primary thing when it comes to that major transit or that transit of Mercury this month in terms of looking at short-term transits. I'm just checking that chat really quickly to see if anybody has any questions as we're getting towards the end of this, especially if you have Virgo or Virgo rising. Somebody says, how would you say that the Mercury transits this year impact one with a Mercury annual profection? I would just say that you want to pay much more attention to aspects that transiting Mercury makes this year. So things like the retrogrades will be more important for you if Mercury is activated by annual profection this year, by being in either a Virgo or a Gemini profection year. But also pay attention to your natal Mercury placement and any transits that planet gets over the course of this year, because those are going to be heightened and are going to stand out much more. Any other questions? So somebody asked about divorce as being a possible manifestation of this transit. I wouldn't necessarily go that far. I mean, it depends on what your natal chart is, and that's going to be a much more specific type of question to the natal chart. This is more just like the potential for, in a most constructive sense, it's going to be a Mercury retrograde in the 7th. So it's like rethinking and sometimes renegotiating the boundaries of one's relationships and sort of love life. But in the worst case scenario, it can be miscommunication and misunderstandings when it comes to relationship, which then you have to spend a lot of time sort of resolving and being very deliberate about communicating in order to clear up the misunderstandings and things like that. So whether that compounds other things that are going on in your life or in your relationship, it very well could, but it's going to be very relative to your individual situation. Somebody said, does this apply to Virgo moons? Yeah, especially if you have a night chart, then some of these transits are going to be very relevant to you because they're going to be aspecting your natal moon. And especially if you're born at night and you have the moon in Virgo, then some of those transits are going to be much more, are going to stand out to you in a way that's notable, even if you don't have Virgo rising. Positive slant on Mercury-Neptune conjunction. Sure. So let's see. One of the positive things about Mercury-Neptune is the ability to inspire, like being really inspired by relationships, or sometimes even having artistic inspiration from relationships. Or sometimes Neptune can be like getting involved with a partner who has either a real artistic bent, or sometimes has a real like mystical or sort of quasi-spiritual bent, who can, through the relationship, sort of expose you to like ideas and realms that maybe you're not very familiar with, but that are somehow constructive or useful in some way. Of course, there can be a downside to that because sometimes it can be sort of like an illusion or not all it's cracked up to be, and you want to be definitely careful about that you're not sort of headed down a path that looks one way, but then it later turns out to be something else. And that's always the challenge with Neptune transits, is to stay grounded during that transit to some extent and not completely be swept off your feet. But those are some of the more positive manifestations of a transit like that, I think. And for some people who are artists or artistically inclined, a significant Mercury-Neptune conjunction like that's in one of the angular houses can definitely coincide with a period of greater artistic inspiration and output. So those are some of the things I would mention in terms of that. So we're getting towards the end of this. Does anybody else have any questions about any of the transits coming up in February of 2019 before I wrap up this horoscope for the month? All right. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining. It looks like that's it for questions for now. So this is an experiment with live streaming where I live streamed it to YouTube and Facebook and Twitter at the same time. If you want to get notifications about future live streams, then just subscribe to me on YouTube at youtube.com/theastrologyschool, or subscribe to me on Twitter at twitter.com/ChrisBrennan7. And if you do that, then you'll get the notifications next time I do some sort of live stream like this. And if all goes well, and depending on the feedback, I might make this a regular thing in the future. So thanks everybody for joining me today. Thanks for all your questions in the live chat. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, let me know in wherever these videos are posted in the future, since the live replay or the replay should be available shortly after this is concluded. So good luck everybody in February. Hope you have good transits, and I will see you again in March for your horoscopes for next month. So in the meantime, good luck and take care. All right, bye.